Most women don't realize the full magnitude of their silence until it echoes in the soul of a man who never expected to be haunted by her absence. He had felt sure of himself once. Like many men, he believed that control was love, that presence was power, that availability was the measure of devotion. He was used to her showing up, to the small rituals, the texts answered, the concern expressed, the rhythm of her affection, predictable like the ticking of a clock. But then, she was gone. No announcement, no farewell, not even a bitter closing line, just the cold vacancy where her voice used to be. And that silence, it didn't just irritate him, it hollowed him, because this was no ordinary goodbye. This was an archetypal rupture, one that touched something older than memory, something primal. According to Jungian psychology, what she triggered was the collapse of a projection. He hadn't truly seen her. He had seen only the image he cast upon her, the muse, the caregiver, the mirror. She had become a canvas for his unconscious feminine, the Anima. And when she vanished, it wasn't just a woman who disappeared. It was his reflection, his identity. You may think he moved on quickly, dated someone new, found distractions. But deep down, he never understood what happened. Because she didn't explain. She didn't fight. She didn't justify or defend her vanishing. She just evaporated like mist at sunrise, leaving behind questions he didn't know how to ask. And in those unspoken words, he was forced to meet something far more terrifying than rejection: himself. This is where the story turns inward. You see, the woman who disappears without warning doesn't do it out of cruelty. She does it because she's finally seen the truth, not just about him, but about herself. She realizes she's been feeding a connection built on fragments, crumbs of attention wrapped in rituals of approval. And when the soul awakens, it doesn't scream, it slips away, it reclaims. Her detachment isn't an act of power, it's a return to it. Because what she's escaping is not just the man, it's the version of herself that tolerated the emotional drought, the slow bleed of self-worth, the ache of waiting to be chosen. And once she tastes the clarity of silence, she no longer bargains with noise. The man left behind? He begins to spiral. Because the feminine energy he once drew upon, her nurturing, her softness, her availability, was never truly hers in his eyes. It was a resource, an energy supply, and in her disappearance he is forced into confrontation with a void he had always covered with women, work, or war. Do you understand what this means? To be left without explanation is, for some men, the beginning of real introspection. When no narrative is given, the ego panics. The mind cannot close the loop, and the absence becomes a mirror, not of her, but of his own blind spots, his expectations, his emotional laziness, his refusal to see beyond the surface. Carl Jung once said that what you do not bring to consciousness appears in your life as fate. And she, yes, she, became the fate that cracked his illusion, not with fury, but with absence, the kind of absence that doesn't beg to be filled, the kind that invites transformation through the ache of confusion. Because her silence was not emptiness, it was a threshold, and the man who once thought himself untouchable begins to unravel in stages. First confusion, then resentment, then, eventually, remorse. Not always expressed, not always admitted, but deeply felt, in the quiet moments, in the shadows of new relationships that lack the depth he once dismissed, in the eyes of women who don't challenge him the way she did simply by existing. You see, some women are not meant to explain their departure, because their worth was never up for debate, and their disappearance is not a ghosting, it's a liberation, not from the man himself, but from the story that taught her to tolerate half-love, to decode coldness as mystery, to endure as virtue. And for the man, When she's gone and no explanation is given, he cannot retaliate. He cannot argue with a phantom. He cannot blame a silent sky. He is left with only one place to go: inward. That's where the true reckoning begins. He'll try to forget her, of course, at first with bravado. With hollow conquests and louder laughter, he'll convince his friends, and perhaps even himself, that she was dramatic, unstable, too sensitive. He'll rewrite her absence as immaturity, her silence as manipulation, because the ego's first line of defense is always distortion. But something in him knows better. It knows she saw through him, not just the curated version he presented to the world, but the fractured boy beneath the armor, the one who never learned how to hold space for another without needing control, the one who mistook dominance for strength and detachment for safety. She saw him, and perhaps that's why her disappearance cut deeper than any argument ever could. He begins to realize, slowly and painfully, that presence is not owed, it is chosen. And she had stopped choosing him long before she walked away. Her body may have stayed for a while, but her soul had started slipping away the moment she realized her depth was being wasted on someone who only drank from her surface. And that is the wound he can't cauterize, because it's not just that she left, it's that she withdrew her meaning. She was once the lighthouse, the orbit, the grounding, presence, and without warning, she became the void. No messages to decode, no lingering scent, no breadcrumbs, just a silence so pure it echoed his own emotional negligence back to him. This is what Jung would call the collapse of the projected archetype. The anima, the inner feminine, was never developed in him. So he sought it in women, in her. He made her carry his emotional compass, his ability to feel, to connect, to be vulnerable. And when she left, he was stranded in the unfamiliar terrain of his own psyche. For the first time, he had to sit with feelings he didn't understand. You don't just recover from a woman who leaves without explaining. You become undone by her, because she becomes a myth in your mind, a question mark carved into your ribcage. She doesn't give you the luxury of closure, and that forces you to seek closure in the one place you've always avoided: yourself. Somewhere in this unraveling, if he's brave enough, he may begin the long walk toward individuation. He may begin to understand that love was never about possession or control, that a woman's silence isn't an attack, it's a boundary, that her absence isn't a punishment, it's a mirror. But to see that, he must stop blaming her for disappearing and start asking why he never noticed she was fading. You, who are listening now, need to understand something. A woman does not vanish easily. She leaves in layers. Emotionally first, then spiritually, then, finally, physically, and when she goes without a trace, it's because she's already mourned the relationship in silence for months, maybe even years. By the time she walks, she is already free. And this is the true power she holds. Not the power to hurt, but the power to unmask, to break the illusion he clung to reveal the emotional bankruptcy hidden beneath charisma and charm. Her vanishing exposes the imbalance. She gave too much. He gave just enough to keep her unsure, until she wasn't. And now, everything he touches feels lesser. Every woman he meets is measured against the one who never asked to be compared. Every smile is filtered through the ache of what he lost but never truly appreciated. This is not a curse, it's a consequence. One not inflicted by her, but by the emotional echo chamber he refused to leave. Because when a man builds his sense of self upon the availability of another, her withdrawal becomes his unraveling. And so, piece by piece, he is left to reconstruct a self that was never truly whole to begin with. He remembers the way she used to look at him, not with need, but with understanding. And that's what haunts him. She didn't need him. She chose him. And now, in her absence, he realizes he was never prepared to be truly chosen. Because being chosen requires depth, presence, vulnerability, and he had only trained for performance. Now he walks the ruins of a connection he never fully stepped into, and the silence she left behind hums like a sacred wound, never bleeding, never healing, just present, like a ghost he can't bury. Somewhere between his regret and his denial, a strange thing begins to happen. He starts seeing her in places she's never been. Not her exactly, but her echo. In the bookstore, he catches the scent of the perfume she used to wear and freezes mid-step, heart clenched like a fist. In the laugh of a stranger, he hears a cadence that stirs something primal, familiar and foreign all at once. At night, in the stillness between distractions, he hears her voice, not speaking, but being, the way only a woman who once loved in silence can haunt. But these aren't hauntings in the ghostly sense. They are reminders from the unconscious, messages from the depths of his own neglected soul. Because she was never just a woman, she was a mirror, and what he misses now is not just her, it's the part of himself he was too afraid to claim when she offered it. In Jungian terms, she embodied what he disowned. She held his tenderness, his chaos, his longing for meaning. And when she left, those qualities didn't vanish. They returned to him, raw and unprocessed. He no longer had her energy to outsource his emotional reality. Now, he must feel for himself, and he doesn't know how. So, he drinks more, or works later, or scrolls endlessly into the synthetic numbness of the digital void. Anything to avoid sitting still with the ghost of the woman who didn't slam the door, but simply stopped opening it. He tells himself she was complicated, she was distant, but that isn't true, and he knows it. She was responsive, just not to his manipulation. She was open, but not to his withholding. She was devoted, but not to the version of love that made her feel small. And that is where his memory betrays him. Because over time, the details fade. But the feeling, that lingering sensation that someone once saw through his masks and loved him anyway, that remains. That sharp, sacred ache of being known and still adored, that is what he can't replicate. Do you understand now? Her disappearance was never a trick. It was a final act of self-respect. The last boundary drawn when every other one had been crossed. The kind of exit that doesn't need a door slammed because it was never about drama. It was about reclaiming dignity. And somewhere inside, he knows that. He knows she stayed longer than she should have. That she tried. Softly at first, then louder, then in silence. He remembers the subtle ways she checked out, how she no longer laughed at his jokes, how her texts became measured, how her eyes stopped dancing in his presence. All signs he ignored, all signs he minimized, rationalized, dismissed, because in his mind, she'd never leave. He was wrong. She left the moment she realized her love had become labor, when her empathy was no longer received, only consumed. When she saw that her efforts were being measured like currency rather than cherished like grace. She left because her presence was never fully met, only managed, and she knew that staying would cost her more than it would heal. And now, he sits in the aftermath. Not with anger, but with a kind of reverence. Because only now does he understand the kind of woman she was. One who doesn't scream, doesn't chase, doesn't beg to be heard. A woman whose silence speaks louder than 1,000 arguments. She vanished, yes, but in doing so, she became unforgettable. And that's the paradox. It's not the woman who yells or pleads that leaves the deepest mark. It's the one who disappears in full awareness of her worth. The one who walks away not to hurt you, but to heal herself. The one who loves you so deeply that she refuses to let you keep loving her halfway. He'll never admit this openly. Most men don't. They bury it beneath bravado and busyness. But it lives in him now, quietly, eternally. The lesson she didn't teach with words, but with absence. The realization that losing her wasn't just about her, it was about everything he refused to become in order to keep her. And in this way, she continues to change him. From afar, from silence, from the sacred space where women reclaim their power and men are forced to meet their soul. Some nights, when the world is quiet and the noise finally dies down, he wonders what would have happened if he had listened, not just to her words, but to her energy, to the subtle shifts in her tone, the weariness behind her eyes, the moments when she smiled but wasn't smiling at all. He replays those scenes in his mind like old films. Her hand, reaching out to touch his, met with a distracted scroll. Her voice softening to ask a vulnerable question, met with a joke. Her silence during arguments, not because she had nothing to say, but because she had already said it too many times. He thought silence was surrender. He never realized it was a signal. This is the final warning before goodbye. But no alarms rang when she left. No explosion, no breakdown. Just the slow unfurling of a woman who had finally stopped trying to convince someone out of her worth. And now he sees it, too late as most men do, not as a betrayal, but as a lesson written in the language of absence. Jung said that the meeting of two personalities is like the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. She didn't just change him, she dismantled the illusions he held about love, femininity, and power. Not by trying to, but simply by refusing to remain in a dynamic that required her to shrink. This is where the masculine psyche fractures, when it is no longer fed by the feminine it once consumed carelessly. Because deep down, he was fed by her emotional labor, her intuition, her presence, the way she held space for his rough edges without asking for much in return. It was a quiet form of love, so quiet in fact that he mistook it for passivity, until it was gone. Now, he feels her in the silence, not in haunting, but in echo, in the quiet discontent he feels with other women who demand less but also give less, in the hollow flings that never reach the depth she held in just one glance, in the strange, aching admiration he now feels toward her independence, once mocked, now missed. Because she wasn't just a lover, she was an initiation, a feminine archetype that walked into his life like a mirror wrapped in softness, and when he refused to look, shattered it on the floor of his denial. And now, the shards cut. Not with vengeance, but with memory. Not with anger, but with understanding. And you, yes, you, who've been that woman, know this path too well. You know what it costs to love from your soul, to give from your depths and watch someone sip casually from what you bled to offer. You know the ache of staying longer than you should have, hoping he'd see. And you know the peace, the sacred, irreversible peace that comes when you finally walk away without explaining. You don't do it to punish. You do it because the words have already been said in 1,000 ways. Through touch, through tears, through truth withheld. And one day, your body can no longer carry the weight of being unseen. So you rise, quietly, and disappear. And though he may never say it, never text it, never admit it to anyone, you became the woman he never recovered from. Not because you broke him, but because you held up the mirror to his emotional immaturity and then refused to keep reflecting it. You left the stage and, in doing so, revealed the hollowness of the script he'd been playing all along. Now, in the stillness of his nights, he doesn't wonder why you left. He wonders why he didn't follow. Not physically, no, but emotionally, spiritually. Why he didn't grow alongside you. Why he let the distance between you widen, choosing comfort over courage. He sees now that you weren't asking for more time or more gifts. You were asking for depth, for presence, for a man who could hold you not in ownership, but in awe. And he couldn't, so you left. And in leaving, you didn't abandon him. You invited him to Meet the man he was too afraid to become. You became the catalyst of his inner storm, the holy disruption he never asked for but always needed. And that is why he never recovered. Not because he lost you, but because losing you meant confronting himself. In time, the world forgets. New faces enter, seasons shift, and the external rhythm of his life continues. He works, he smiles, he even loves again, or tries to. But beneath the surface, something remains fractured. Not visible to all, but unmistakable to the soul. Because the woman who vanished without explanation didn't just leave a gap, she left a mark, a psychic scar etched into the fabric of his becoming, not as punishment, but as prophecy, a symbol of the path he must walk now if he is to ever become whole. For some, the story ends here, with regret, stagnation, the quiet ache of a lesson unlearned. But others, they awaken, and it begins subtly. He finds himself craving silence, not to numb, but to listen. He sits with old wounds, begins to notice the ways he shuts down, the ways he deflects love when it arrives vulnerable and unguarded. He rereads conversations, hears her voice in his memory, not the sound, but the meaning. He realizes how often she had tried to speak in ways he didn't understand because he wasn't ready to hear. And slowly, piece by piece, he begins the long work of reassembly, not of the relationship, but of himself. This is the journey Jung called individuation, the slow, painful emergence of the true self from the rubble of the persona. He begins to confront his shadows, the fear of intimacy, the pride that masqueraded as strength, the need to be needed that dressed itself as love. And though she is gone, she is present in this rebirth. Because the feminine, in its most powerful form, doesn't just nurture, it initiates. It dismantles illusions, calls out the soul, strips away the ego's comfort. Her departure wasn't abandonment. It was initiation by fire, a sacred exile. And now, he walks, that desert alone, thirsty for truth, aching for a center that no longer exists in anyone else, but only within. And you, who disappeared without explaining, you may never know the full ripple of your departure. You may never see the nights he spent in silence, the poems he never wrote, the lessons he never confessed aloud. But know this, you were never forgotten. Not because of drama or damage, but because of clarity. You left not to escape, but to expand. You left because staying meant dying in increments. And now, somewhere in the private chambers of his soul, he carries the altar of your absence. Not in bitterness, but in reverence. You weren't just a woman. You were a turning point. You were the last mirror he refused to face, and the first truth he could never outrun. And in that, you became eternal. So what happens now? Now, you live freely. You walk lighter. You love yourself louder. You no longer explain because your energy speaks for you. You no longer prove because your presence confirms everything. You no longer chase because your essence attracts what's real. You know your worth, not as a weapon, but as a compass. The world may not always reward the woman who walks away, but life honors her. She becomes the thunder that clears the sky, the silence that awakens the sleeping, the story that never quite ends, because it rewrites the man who thought she was just a chapter. And when he dreams now, he doesn't dream of her return. He dreams of becoming the kind of man who could have kept her. But for you, it's no longer about being kept. It's about being known by yourself, fully, fiercely, and without compromise. You are no longer the woman who waits for clarity from another. You are the clarity. You are the mirror that no longer bends to reflect anyone but your own radiant soul. You are the storm and the stillness, the ache and the answer. The woman who knows her worth doesn't chase, she chooses.